We are here for this public lecture where CODESRIA and Makerere locate their intersection. And as we celebrate the institute, the Gender Institute at CODESRIA. What is CODESRIA? CODESRIA is the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. You're most welcome. We welcome each one of us. Thank you so much for coming. We welcome the CODESRIA team, including the Executive Secretary. You're most welcome to Makerere University. We welcome the management of Makerere University. We have the staff, Makerere University, here in the house. You're most welcome. We have the students' body. You are most welcome. The performing arts and film, led by Dr. Benon Kigozi, they are already set. They are going to give us, how do you call it? A sample of what they are capable of doing. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. To begin with, you very much, the Performing Arts and Film, led by Dr. Benon Kigozi. We welcome the Deputy Vice Chancellor. We welcome the Executive Secretary, CODESRIA. We welcome the Principal. CHUS. CHUS means the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. We welcome, and CHUS is always on the move. I don't know what it would be, what Makerere would be without CHUS. But do you know the roots of CHUS? The roots of CHUS, the mother of CHUS, is the School of Women and Gender Studies. So the vibe that you see in CHUS, the roots are down there in the School of Women and Gender Studies. So we want to welcome the Dean, the School of Women and Gender Studies, the staff, Gender Studies, DRGT represented, gender mainstreaming, the CODESRIA team, you're most welcome, particularly those who may not be residing in this country, beautiful Uganda, you're most welcome. Today, the theme of today's talk is CODESRIA's experience with gender research towards a feminist epistemic breakthrough. Don't ask me what epistemic means, because this is exactly what we are going to unpack. And the great professors are here. They are going to unpack what this epistemic breakthrough is as CODESRIA takes the lead. Also today, CODESRIA celebrates 50 years, I think, of establishment this year. And so this also marks the anniversary. Of course, we also celebrate with the Gender Institute under CODESRIA. Now, I've also been able to get a hint of what the mandate, even when I do not have probably maybe the authority, but I would say that I could talk about the mandate so that we get to understand who CODESRIA is. And the mandate is to support African researchers to produce knowledge. African researchers to produce, not to just use, but to produce knowledge. And elevate African voices in global discourses. Meaning, we have always said that Africans are missing in the global discourse. So it is the duty of CODESRIA, they have promised to do that, to elevate African voices in global discourses on issues that affect Africa and Africans around the world. And therefore, once we've got to know what their mandate is, so then we can engage with those who will be presenting about CODESRIA, or those who are coming from CODESRIA, those who have researched with CODESRIA. And therefore, the questions that maybe we need to hear or engage with are, what intellectual influence has CODESRIA had over the 50 years? So definitely that will come up in our discussions. What has been put in place? What kind of environment is in place to facilitate the epistemic breakthrough that we are talking about? So from today, this discussion or engagement should rejuvenate our academic journey and scholarship, particularly gender and feminist scholarship, because this is the reason we are here. We want to hear why gender matters. We want to hear why feminist scholarship matters. The Gender Institute under CODESRIA began in 1994. Now that is not my duty, somebody is going to do that. But we want to engage with the state of feminist debates within CODESRIA and Africa, and what is the future of gender and feminist scholarship in Africa. These are critical reflections that will be unfolding in this event, and I want to assure you that it's going to be very interesting I want to assure us that you don't even just want to miss 5 minutes, just to be present and call those that may not have come yet. So, having introduced, I do not have the powers, of course, as I said, there are professors here who are going to talk about and engage with these questions I'm raising. At this moment, before I start talking a lot on council space, this is council space, this is university space, I think we need to recognize the presence of the management to take their seats so that I'm not caught off guard. So we are going to invite the Vice Chancellor, here represented by Professor Umar Kakumba, to please take your seat so that I feel safe in this space. I will also invite the Executive Secretary, CODESRIA, to please take your seat. I will invite the Principal Chus to take their seat. And I'll also invite the Dean of the most critical school in the university, the Dean of Women and Gender Studies, to take their seat. And once I do that, I do not have a lot of powers to invite them to speak, because they are going to definitely to speak to us. But now I have to invite my Dean, the School of Women and Gender Studies. You know, in Africa, we respect authority. So the Dean is going then to invite the principal, and after the principal, she knows the protocol better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anne Sima. Our principal, the executive director, CODESRIA, the vice chancellor, the other vice chancellors from sister universities, our guests from all over Africa, and our students and everybody else. You're very welcome to Makerere University. I should have said all protocol observed, but I think I've covered all the protocol. So it's a great day for us to be here. Very welcome to Makerere University School of Women and Gender Studies, but also to Makerere University Central Teaching Facility, Yusuf Lule Lecture Hall. It is a great honor for us to be hosting the CODESRIA Gender Institute. For me personally, it is a special honor, considering that I think I applied twice and I never succeeded. And I concluded these things I think are not for me, I don't qualify. Even when those who were in it were close friends like Professor George Chikata, Professor Koswa Dakwa, Professor Charles Ukeje, Professor Mamdani. So the Gender Institute is a prestigious thing. And for those of you who have qualified to come here as participants, consider yourself very, very privileged. So, and for us as a school and as a university, we would like to thank CODESRIA for finding it worthwhile to make us host this event. The principal will give the detail of the event. I know it's a 3-day event of a lot of reflection of where we have come from as gender scholars on the continent. The event, or the Gender Institute, comes to Makerere University at a critical moment. Last year, we celebrated 30 years of the School of Women and Gender Studies, where we were also reflecting on 30 years of progress and how are we repositioning for the future. And indeed, among the things that came out was this whole emphasis of bringing Africa together, bringing African gender scholars together. And out of that, actually, we created a network of Pan-African, feminist, gender, and women's studies scholars on the continent. It was launched in July, and by Professor Amina Mama from here in Makerere. So we are still at initial steps. This year, we've been privileged to host the CODESRIA Gender Institute, which again is on reflecting on the role of gender in the work or in the research of CODESRIA. But beyond that, I mean, these are some of the things which are occurring, but beyond that, it's a total reflection of what is the place and space of gender studies on the African continent. When we celebrated 30 years, the key question was, how do we situate Africa as a site of knowledge production, not just knowledge consumption or knowledge use? And it was really coming from the fact that many of us on the continent and in the Caribbean, because we've shared some of these experiences, when we teach even something like feminist theory, we all begin with Mary Wollstonecraft, we begin with liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, socialist feminism, radical. Then by the time you come to Africa, it is now in the other feminisms, African feminism, third world feminism, post-colonial feminism. And the whole question is, how does this advantage us as produce and us as Africans and us as located on the continent and in the Caribbean as producers of knowledge, as opposed to just using? And of course, this also brought us to another issue that weren't there feminist scholars on the continent, weren't there gender activists on the continent. We know that the history of struggle by women on the continent has been there even before colonialism. But why doesn't it lend itself to being used for teaching in class? And I think at this Gender Institute, for me personally, two questions that I would like to be answered, and that have always been posed to me, and maybe I don't have answers. How do you decolonize gender knowledge? How do you decolonize feminist knowledge? We are in the phase of decolonization. So this is something for us to reflect on, so that by Friday, when Dr. Murunga is packing his bags and going, he has given us an answer, plus everyone who has come. So that is one. How do we decolonize gender knowledge? The number two is, how do we tap into knowledge? Because the project of decolonization means also centering other kinds of knowledge, not just the Western kind of discourses in the academia. But we find that African knowledge, including African feminist knowledge, is located in ways that don't pass as sometimes scholarly, because these are people in the community, really bring out a lot of wisdom. Of course, once in a while we collect it using qualitative data. But is there another way where we can situate African oratory, African historiographies, other than locating them in history here, the women's studies there, and whatever? How do we center them as disciplines and as theories to drive development on the continent, so that they're not just other? You know, you talk about philosophy, then African philosophy. You talk about gender studies, then African gender studies. So it's like there's a mainstream body of knowledge, and then there's this other body of knowledge, which is situated in a certain space, but is a subjective body of knowledge. So I'm not here to give a speech. I'm here to just welcome you to Makerere University, but to say those are my two questions, which I battle with every day. How do we decolonize gender studies? And how do we tap into those knowledge systems of our people and center them when they did not publish a book? If you went to your grandparents and they gave you knowledge and your grandparents did not publish a book, how do you cite that kind of knowledge? And how then do we use it in scholarship, other than just as a quotation in a bigger research project? Thank you very much, and without wasting much time, allow me to welcome my boss and my supervisor and my principal, who is none other than Professor Josephina Hichire, and I think she will take the debate further than here. My role ends here. Thank you.
Professor Sari, your role has just begun. It hasn't ended. Good afternoon, everyone. The Dean, School of Women and Gender Studies, has really said everything, so even if I don't say anything. The Vice Chancellor, Makerere University, here represented by the Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of Academic Affairs, Professor Omar Kakumba,
We are gratified that you are able to make it. This is exam time, and as an office in charge of academic affairs, we know what that means in actual sense. So really, we are gratified that you're able to spare some time to be at this event. We also welcome the Executive Secretary, Professor Godwin Murunga, Executive Secretary, CODESRIA. Thank you for the bold step. We last had a big CODESRIA event in 1990 when there was this big conference on academic freedom. And we wondered whether there had been a divorce or something, but Godwin kept on promising that, no, Makerere is on my radar. And indeed, we know that Makerere is really part of CODESRIA. Karibu sana, you're welcome. From here, I'm going to be saying Godwin because that's what he prefers. Our elders, the vice chancellors, Vice Chancellor of Kampala University, Professor Joy Kwesiga, who was also part of the founding members of the School of Women and Gender Studies and the Dean of the School of Social Sciences. You're welcome home. Also a former VC, but now Executive Director of the VC's Forum, Professor Rubujo. He reminded us that he was once in Senate, and when they said Makerere should establish gender studies, there was reaction, uproar, but he was one of the lone voices who said, this is something worthwhile. No wonder you've made your time to come here. The Directorate of Research and Graduate Training, here represented by Professor Julius Chikoma. We expected more graduate students, but we know they are writing exams. So we are happy that some of them are here, and we are gratified that you're able to take time, because these events are the ones that actually scale up learning of our students beyond the lecture room and motivates them also to become distinguished intellectuals, as it were. Our distinguished scholars from all over the continent. We have guests scholars from all over, Cameroon, Dakar, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, DRC, Tanzania, Namibia, Mauritius, Sudan. Some of us were wondering, how did the Sudanese make it? But she did, because of that interest. So all these countries, we are converging here to take this conversation forward of how do we make an epistemic breakthrough in gender research on the continent, as the Dean has already talked about or alluded to. The CHOOS community, please wave and welcome our, CHOOS staff and students. Thank you for really making this time. It's exam time, so we don't take that for granted. The team that came from Dakar, Senegal, please wave. Thank you for coming. The local organizing team at Makerere School of Women and Gender Studies, you can wave. Yes. So those are the people that have made it possible for us to be here. And all of you present, our dear Francois, our dear professors who are in the booth translating for us. One time, the president said we need to have a language that connects the whole of Africa. But I think that is a long walk, and maybe that's part of decolonization, that we are able to actually communicate through mediums that are foreign. This is part of history, but maybe those generations that are coming after us will have a better decolonization agenda. We are here to debate, to listen, to learn, and for me as a principal, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, I'm gratified that we are able to have such an open conversation. When we started this conversation with Godwin, it was supposed to be a normal small meeting of maybe 40 people somewhere in a room with AC and tablecloths and all that, very comfortable. But we said that as Makerere, our tradition is that if you get a collection of distinguished scholars, they should not leave the hill without talking to the community of Makerere University. And so for us, we said, let's have this afternoon where we open and we are able, for some of the students who are able to make it, are attending and also being motivated, because we are doing a kind of intergenerational conversation. We want to see those quotable scholars, who is behind them. When they look back, who is behind them? How are we creating them? Are we intentional in actually creating a formidable force as young African scholars? We shall do that by opening up, by engaging students, and not just holding them up in the lecture room. Of course, the lecture room is important. And so that's why we are here, and we think that this is a kind of conversation that is able to help us also to move outside of the box. So as CODESRIA, many people, when you ask, do you know CODESRIA? What is that? Because there has been some lag, also COVID, sort of scaled down many activities, even online and so on, even if it is online. But CODESRIA, as a space, as a continental space, has been very critical in creating the Pan-African sort of front. So you create a space where African scholars are able to congregate and make an intellectual community. When you act alone, it's okay, you can publish and you can flourish, but when you act in a collective, you're able to make a legitimate kind of force in terms of some of the questions that the Dean has put on our table. The fact that then you're able to actually make part of a collective. And for some people, they have CODESRIA in their capillaries without knowing. Either you've been taught by somebody who has been mentored through the CODESRIA process, and you have no idea. So I came in contact with CODESRIA in 1989, and so people like Dr. Milton Wabiona are there saying, what is CODESRIA? I'm here. I'm here. So that capillary kind of effect, many people that you interact with have actually been nurtured through that space. And it's really something that we need to cultivate to move out of the sort of market trend where what is in for me, what is it, that kind of transactional, to begin to find spaces that are able to create us as African intellectuals and make a contribution on the global terrain of knowledge. And I would like really to stop there and sort of say, welcome all of you. Let's have a debate. We are not going to have mark sheets for those who have come out of the exam. This is a free space, and we are able to engage and welcome all knowledge. At this point, let me invite, I promised to say Godwin, Professor Godwin Murunga, this is the last time I'm saying that, to come and give a brief, and then we can proceed. Thank you very much. Gender in CODESRIA has been like Mandela's long walk to freedom, and I think he's going to briefly talk about that. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much, Professor Josephine Aikire. The Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic Affairs, Professor Omar Pekumba, representing the Vice Chancellor of Makerere University, other Vice Chancellors present or former present here today, colleagues from the University of Makerere, the Dean School of Women and Gender Studies, all other colleagues who have joined us for this reflections meeting on gender at CODESRIA. First of all, I want to begin by thanking the university, Makerere University, for not just accepting to host us for this event that we are having for the next 3 days, but also for going out of your way to make us feel comfortable. In the room, among the colleagues who have joined us from different parts of the continent and beyond, actually, we have more than 10 countries represented here. And Josephine, if you allow, has mentioned some of them. Did she mention Nigeria? That is a travesty against everything. I got Josephine on that one. We have more than 10 countries represented here. And it's my way of making the point that the very logic of CODESRIA's operation is to begin to connect African academics and policy actors from different diversities of the continent, attempting in our work to break the various barriers that make it difficult for us to communicate with each other in Africa. And so the linguistic barriers, the intergenerational barriers are some of the things that we try to break. And in that, therefore, begin to generate knowledge that not only speaks to the realities of Africans around the continent and beyond, but also that speaks, inserts our voices in global discussions about anything that they are discussing, what be it gender, development, and any of that. And my major pleasure today, actually honor today, is that I am charged with leading the council at the moment when CODESRIA is actually celebrating its 50th anniversary. There are not too many organizations on the continent that are able to go through the youthful crisis and mature all the way, survive midlife crisis. And CODESRIA has survived all this, and we are happy. Thank you. We are happy that we are able to hold a series of reflections and celebrations in many countries on the continent, including, most importantly, being in Uganda. So this is really a pleasure for me, and I'm very grateful for this. We are here not necessarily because we just woke up one day and decided off the top of our head, Makerere would be the place. We are here deliberately because CODESRIA and Makerere University have a long history. And that history is marked by the interventions into the CODESRIA discussions by a number of colleagues who have been at Makerere University, who have made the Makerere presence in Dakar and in many other places where we hold our meetings visible. So it would be remiss of me not to mention that among our former presidents of CODESRIA is Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who is himself Ugandan, but also a senior colleague here in Makerere. Having founded the Center for Basic Research after teaching in the Department of Political Science, and the Kampala meeting that Josephine is referring to, which happened here in Kampala in 1990, was in fact a meeting that was hosted here in Kampala in collaboration with the Center for Basic Research, and Makerere University was centrally involved in that initiative. I'm not going also to miss the fact that among some of our leading academics today in CODESRIA, some of them honed their teeth in these processes of interaction. So I'm reminded almost every time when I talk about this, the presence of Professor Sylvia Tamale, who not only is a core member of CODESRIA, someone we call upon to join us for whatever institutes that we run, for whatever activities we run, but has actually been a resource person to one of our gender institutes which we held in Dakar, and which you can find the reflections online in our YouTube channel. And Sylvia has published extensively around the world, but we are happy to share in that record of publication because she's published also extensively in CODESRIA publications. Similarly, Professor Joe Loka Onyango, who actually was a rapporteur at the 1990 Kampala conference that led to the Kampala Declaration on academic freedom and the responsibility of the intellectual, which has become an instrument that guides our thinking around academic freedom. But, this is the important part, anytime it's mentioned, you can't finish the sentence without putting there Kampala. So I am at a loss to understand why Josephine thinks that we have been away. Because we took the name, and we have run away with the name of your own country in a manner that is positive and of positive impact, if you will, to the rest of the intellectual community, not just in Africa, but beyond. And I could mention many other people who have participated in this, but allow me to mention that among the people I have benefited from extensively, both in terms of association, but also in terms of contribution to gender studies, is Professor Joy Kwesiga, who is here with us today. And I was never the executive secretary when Professor Joy Kwesiga was involved in a range of CODESRIA programs. But I was always lucky to be invited in many of those engagements. And my first engagement with Professor Kwesiga was in the Gender Symposium. We always had a pilgrimage to Cairo every year to attend the CODESRIA Gender Symposium. And I'm really, really happy to be able to be here. Partly also because the story of the School for Women and Gender Studies is incomplete without the name of Professor Joy Kwesiga. In many ways, therefore, the two schools that are convening us today are joined at the hip with CODESRIA through the participation of several of the dons at Makerere University who have enriched our thinking around gender. Let me also mention that in the process of producing knowledge, we've had the pleasure of publishing actually many books on Uganda. And so when I was coming to Makerere University, my team gave me an additional luggage to carry. And that luggage has books which I have been instructed to donate to the university. I hope that Professor Josephine Hikire will accept this donation from CODESRIA, and we will present this a little later on. Or would you want to present them now? Okay, my pleasure to present them to the university. And in some of those books are stories of the struggles of ordinary Ugandans. We published long ago a study titled Uganda, Studies in Labor. Josephine, you have a chapter in this book. It's published, we publish it through a network with the CBR, Center for Basic Research. We've also published the experience of the former Vice Chancellor of Makerere University. It's a huge book which we will show you later on. So I'm just defending myself secretly, just to make the point that we've been so far but very close. And we've always been thinking about Uganda and Makerere University, and it gives me enormous pleasure to be able, therefore, to say that at any point in time, we are happy, glad, and privileged to be associated with this university, primarily through the networks that have been created, and the people who have made those networks have a life. And we want to thank you most sincerely for hosting us, for accepting whatever we bring, our limitations, our gains. We want to share them with you, and thank you most sincerely again for the opportunity to be here this particular moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Performing Arts and Film. That's from Southwestern. They are showing the energy that they have. Cultures have a way of communicating. This is the energy. Let me take this opportunity to welcome Professor Omar Kakumba, the DVC in charge of academic affairs. DVC academic affairs, actually, this is the very docket. We are just doing delegated responsibility and expanding the academic terrain and vibrancy of Makerere University. Thank you very much for supporting colleges and particularly for supporting CHUS and the School of Women and Elected. Professor Kakumba, you're welcome.
Many thanks to you, the principal, Professor Josephine Aichire. I think you are being extremely generous to me. I imagine that it is me not to be thanked, but rather the other way around. I want to thank you so much, not just for this, but I mean for the whole trajectory of making choose, of driving choose into this phase of renewal and rejuvenation. They say, and we say, choose on the move. So I should thank you for putting choose on the move and the entire team that is here, partnering with the CODESRIA for this CODESRIA Makerere intersections. You will permit me to recognize the Executive Secretary CODESRIA, Godwin Murunga, and also in a special way, I want to recognize our Vice Chancellor Emeritus, our elder, Professor Elia Burugujo. I will ask Professor Rugujo to stand up. Professor Rugujo is many things, but the first thing is Makerere. When you see Professor Rugujo, you see Makerere. When you see Makerere, the images of Professor Rugujo coming as a mathematician, as an engineer, and he left here to go and serve Ndeje University for almost 10 years, tenure as Vice Chancellor, and now is the Executive Secretary of the Vice Chancellor's Forum. So I want to welcome you. I also wish to recognize Professor Joy Kwesiga, just like they are seated together. She's Makerere. First and foremost, she's Makerere, and then many other things, including now the Vice Chancellor of Kampala University, but also a great alumni of this institution, both administration and the academia. Allow me to recognize the effort of the team led by Professor Ichire, here having the Dean of School of Women Gender Studies, the colleagues from the School of Women. I can see distinguished professors here, Sylvia Tamale, and in a special way, you'll permit me to welcome the team of scholars and visiting academics from the 10 countries. I'm told there are 55 coming to attend from outside Uganda this CODESRIA Gender Institute. I want to welcome you to Makerere University. Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished visitors, academia, non-government organizations, civil society, the students, and everybody joining this. It's a great pleasure for me here. They shouldn't say that I am acting Vice Chancellor for your record, Madam Principal, so the Vice Chancellor is here. But I'm also here in my own right, because I was invited and I was scheduled on the program. So I convey to you greetings of Professor Nawangwe, who is away in Brussels in one of our strategic collaborative engagement. But it's also, if I may say, that it's a great pleasure for Makerere University to welcome you for this public lecture and activities to mark the 50th anniversary of the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa, codenamed CODESRIA. And it is also one way of congratulating CODESRIA upon the existence and this anniversary, and also the 28 years that you have marked in running the Gender Institute. We wish to congratulate you, CODESRIA. This public lecture comes at a critical moment, as many of you are aware, where Makerere has celebrated 100 years, and now we are set off for the next century of supporting and rejuvenating the vibrancy of the academia, of the research, to give really a stronger value proposition to our country, to our continent, and humanity at large. I wish to recognize that CODESRIA has been at the forefront of supporting African researchers over time to produce knowledge and elevating the African voices in global discourses on issues that affect Africa and Africans around the world. Maybe I should have said at the beginning, you may not know, but when you search through the records of the 1990s, Professor Murunga, you realize that I'm one of the beneficiaries of CODESRIA. Let me reveal this. In some of our studies with the late Professor Kiki Mujaju in political science, Professor Foster Byarugaba, we received some short grants as to conduct some studies, and then we are involved in traveling for the African youth. We used to have uongozi in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, so CODESRIA was very, very active, and it supported us to grow into these young fellows in research and scholarship. At that time, you were seeing really the engagement, the dialogues. So it reminisces a great, some good memories. And I want to thank you so much for reawakening that. And you preempted my comment, because when I came in, when I received the invitation, I said, CODESRIA, after some long period, I have not heard about CODESRIA. Of course, we are awake to the reality that you've been involved in publishing, in supporting research, and many other things. But perhaps you have been a bit silent in Uganda. But I'm glad that today you are renewing the new connection that you had with Makerere and Uganda for many years ago. So I'm aware that the Council's mandate, the CODESRIA, the Council of Makerere University's mandate is directly in tandem with what we are witnessing now, the intellectual agenda and the intellectual discourse. Makerere's vision 2020-2030 is to be a thought leader in knowledge generation for society transformation and development. Now, you don't need to cram the construction, but there are key words, there are common denominators in this vision of Makerere. One of them is being a thought leader in knowledge generation. The generation of knowledge is very, very critical. And that generation of knowledge, you need it to transform society. But not transforming society for anything else, but for the purpose of development. Because to inform or transform society, you must catch the ground of research, of generating knowledge, of innovations. Because it is these ways that can be able to inform the new trends and the emerging contexts through which we can be able to build value on our societies. Because the aspirations of society keep on changing from time to time. So we cannot be rigid or static to the aspirations of those days of generations. You have young people today, the digital world. But you also have a society that is strongly, advocating for the gender discourse and the realization of the gender roles, in our societies and communities. So fostering gender discourse is a critical requirement for development, as I have stated, and it is in line with our vision. But also, we can't have development without revisiting those critical debates the gender roles in society, and which, if we dare to ignore all of these, then it's a tantamount to ignoring the potential that we have, and then we shall have failed as a society, but also as a community. So as CODESRIA was establishing the Gender Institute in 1994, Makerere University, around the same time, was also establishing the School of Women and Gender Studies. And like Professor Sarasari has shared with us, last year or so, we had here a very, very huge convention where we are recognizing the contribution of the School of Women and Gender, but also celebrating the 30 years of existence. Yeah, so we are proud that from time to time the School of Women and Gender now has made great strides in contributing to policy, to gender equity, equality, establishing structures for mainstreaming within the administrative and the academic functions of the university, but also in the broader building the stronger footprints of the gender scholarships, which are really visible when you look around our audience and our spaces within this university and within this country. So these developments are a clear testament of the institutional commitments to expand and grow the humanities scholarship in the African continent. And you'll allow me also to mention that the increasing demand for to engender humanities and social sciences scholarship, to mainstream gender in development practice, and to adopt gender as an analytical category that can help to legitimize a number of important aspects of the feminist and the gender scholarship on the African continent. So while we have registered great steps in this scholarship, the ever-changing global, regional, and local dynamics, like I have mentioned, in the process of knowledge production, mean that we should always continue to rethink and also rebuild opportunities and dialogues for strengthening our institutions and also our societies. At Makerere University and Uganda as a whole, we are privileged to host this public lecture as a space that brings eminent scholars on the African continent for a lot of reflections. We are optimistic that these conversations will grow the scholarship and also nurture the intellectual networks and create possible pathways for knowledge production from within the African continent to positively impact the African communities and beyond. So we therefore pay special tribute to you, Professor Murunga, and the entire family of CODESRIA for having chosen Makerere as a collaborative associate in hosting this. And we also want to appreciate yourself and the team gracing this event that is going for the next 3 days. Yeah, the Council's desire to build an autonomous Pan-African social science and humanities research community that is capable of interpreting realities in Africa and also contributing to scholarly public policy debates on African and global issues will definitely be remembered for the years you have existed, but for also the new move that you are envisioning. As Makerere, we want to recognize the research and knowledge production that are key to the African transformation, and we want to bid and pay tribute to your efforts in facilitating and supporting the social science and humanities research scholars across the world through a variety of your programs. Yeah, as I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, once again, you'll permit me to appreciate the vibrancy that is ever exhibited in the choose on the move. And that comes under the aegis of a very, very strong principle, Josephine. But no wonder she's a brain daughter of CODESRIA, and so when she's here, she's speaking all of those languages and all of those anticipations. Thank you so much. And School of Gender, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you, the Dean and the rest of your team for organizing this and engaging. So in a special way, I'll take the opportunity to appreciate all the panelists. We are going to have panelists, as you've seen the program, that have prepared for quite a very, very passionate discussion and discourse over these matters. And the local organizing committee, we don't take it for granted. School of Liberal Performing Arts, outgoing Dean Mangeni, the new Dean Pamela, the Performing Arts Department, Ndugu Chigozi, and your team. We want to thank you so much, and everybody who's gracing this. So it is now my singular honor and privilege to declare the public lecture officially open as we build for the future.
As I said, we carried a few books to just showcase what we produce at CODESRIA. It's the only big thing that we normally would carry when we make a visit anywhere. So here we have a number of books that have been published through the CODESRIA program. So they cover a whole range of topics, but they are all in the social sciences and humanities. So this is a donation that we leave to the university, and hope that you make good use of them, but also I can guarantee you we are going to send more, because that's the only thing we know how to do. For the students who are attending, I have had a complaint that CODESRIA books are not accessible. And I just want to confirm that that is the biggest lie that has ever been told. Because they are all available online free of charge. They are all available online free of charge. Just Google CODESRIA. Thank you very much.
Please allow me to invite our great panelists. The first panelist is Professor Joy Kwesiga, who you've heard is the Vice Chancellor of Kampala University, but is majorly a Makererian. She spent most of her life in Makerere, and she did many things in Makerere, but the most important thing is she was among the founder members of the School of Women and Gender Studies. She was also the first female dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. But those are just two of the very many things she's prominent for. So you're very welcome, Professor Joy Kwesiga. And when you look at the topic she's going to address, Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University, a reflection, given her history here of struggle to have women in the Makerere University systems, in the academia and in administration, and more importantly, to have a school dedicated to nurturing the discipline of gender studies. And and this went two ways, forming the discipline, but also forming the school. So when CODESRIA came up with the idea of reflection, we thought there was no better person who would present this than her. The second panelist is Pinky Mekgwe. Pinky is the Chief Operations Officer for Africa Health Research Institute, South Africa. And she's a former PO of CODESRIA. She'll tell us what PO is about. And she's coming to take us through the reflection of gender research and programming at CODESRIA, the internal experience. And this great panel of ours has been allocated 40 minutes. So we will request our great presenters to use something between 10 and 15 minutes to give us their reflections. You know, reflections are as long as the people remember. So, but at the end of the day, they will give us a chance to ask them some questions where we don't have anything clear. So, Professor Kwesiga, over to you.
I had a PowerPoint presentation, but with the warning given twice by the moderator, I'm not going to use the PowerPoint. Thank you very much, Dean. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this gender, the CODESRIA gender, what? Institute. I appreciate being part of, coming back to Makerere. I congratulate CODESRIA on 50 years, having reached 50 years. I congratulate the executive director. He has been very passionate about not just CODESRIA, but even on gender. I know the work he was doing in the University of Nairobi. I've known him for some time, and I was very happy to see that he's the executive director of CODESRIA. There's been a gap. I was a full member of CODESRIA for many years, but somehow it seems Dakar is very far from Kavari. So there is a bit of gap. I'm happy to meet my fellow panelists again. I met her, Gabarone, some time back, and I'm glad that she has been moving here and there and growing. I congratulate CHUS on moving forward, on the move. Thank you for that, because you know that nationally, social sciences and humanities, you have been warned to go the right direction. So I hope you are on the move in the right direction nationally. So I've been asked to reflect on the Women and Gender Studies Department, or the school. I'll just summarize very briefly for members of the audience who don't know about the institution. When I was introduced this morning, somebody said, we have heard so much about this school, but we are eager to know what it is. So, but I won't go in details because the dean is here. You can always ask questions in the next 2 days. But 1988, start with just a brief history, is a very important year in terms of gender studies or women's studies, because that is when the opportunity to create this school came up. It came up because Makerere University was hosting a group of donors. Makerere University had been going through bad years, and donors thought they needed to regenerate it, and that's the word which was used. And when there was this donors meeting, it coincided with the fact that there was a group of female women activists who were also looking at other areas of development. And gender studies was actually women's studies, as we called it, was one of them, was key. So when this conference was about to start, a group of members of a group called Action for Development joined with the Uganda Association of University Women and moved to the Vice Chancellor's office, Professor George Kilya. Said we need to be put on the agenda to look for funds to start a Women and Gender Studies department. The Vice Chancellor said the agenda is complete, we cannot do anything. We said we can retype the agenda, we can redo it. Then he said, but the other people are not very willing. I don't know what he called the organizers. They were not very willing. Then he said, but who will present the paper? We said there is somebody here who can write the paper. Dr. Maxine Ankura, at that time she was in the associate professor in the Department of Social Work, said I'll present the paper. So the Vice Chancellor had no choice but to accept. And when the paper was presented, the donors were very happy. They said, we are going to support the starting of this department. And that is how the department started. And they offered to give money. CIDA offered to pay for the master's program. They offered to help. The British Council offered to bring literature and all that. And the school started. And it started at a master's level, because first of all, this was a new discipline. It wasn't very accepted. And also there were no teachers. So they said maybe at master's level it will be possible to get the teachers. And eventually that one started in 1989, I think 89. Then later now the undergraduate program, and now there are PhD programs. So that is the kind of growth that has gone through. So I'll be reflecting on the lessons that we have learned from the growth of this institution at different levels. So the first one I want to talk about is the role of donors. Because donations, aid, sometimes are given as, sometimes it is a double-edged sword. So regarding sustainability in particular, here I mentioned that CIDA, the Swedish CIDA, was paying tuition fees and research fees for master's students. The books were being brought by British Council. The Commonwealth Secretariat provided experts as teachers. The Fulbright Fellowship, the American Fulbright Fellowship, provided teachers. The Danish embassy here provided the computers. And I think Makerere University paid salaries, and some miserable old house here near the swimming pool, which was originally a residential house, but where now, happily, the School of Women and Gender Studies stands. So I don't know whether, Sarah, you have a picture of that house. Yeah, so that one is necessary for historical reasons. So donors were basically doing everything, and one would think that maybe this institution may not grow. Eventually, NORAD helped to build this institution, the building that you see. Many other donors have chipped in. As a result, the department was able to host the first Women's World Congress in Uganda, in East Africa in particular. So all those were donations. What is the lesson? The lesson which I derive from here is that once there is institutional goodwill and responsive leadership, it is possible to utilize donor funds and be able to move on even when this support ceases. And this is the example that we can celebrate as a school, that actually we have, although we still need the donations, but we can survive. There is evidence that this school will live on. Otherwise, the master's program would have actually died after sponsorship. So that is the first lesson I reflect on. You can usefully use donations. The second part I would like to talk about is the unique idea, how it started. There have to be drivers of the idea. And in this case, there were a few of the women in Makerere University who had gone abroad to study, and they had heard of gender studies, they had had short courses, and they said, but why can't we formalize this kind of training into a full academic unit? Two ladies, one called Evelyn Nyakojo, she's now a retired teacher, she was a member of staff here. Dr. Maria Musoke at that time was in the university library. She's the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Chambogo University. They introduced this idea but didn't catch on. But at that time, there was an organization, it's still there, but that time it was the organization of the women's movement called Action for Development. It was pushing for change. They said, we are going to see how we get this organization, these studies established in Uganda. And this is how we were able to push, as I mentioned, to the Vice Chancellor and to the donors, coming as a force to be able to move. So why are they unique drivers? Unique drivers because these were members of the institution, Makerere University. Some of us were administrators, others were in the academic field, but the major thing was that we were also activists outside of the university. We were in the women's movement, pushing the women's movement within Uganda. So the issue here that we need to emphasize, there was grassroots support for this institution, the gender studies, within the university and outside of the university in Uganda, not just in Kampala alone. And I think we need to note that this helps to expel the notion that all these things are externally pushed, because this was actually done internally. And once you have these groups and they are dedicated and there is passion, so much passion that people were getting tired of these groups whenever we moved, because it wasn't Makerere University where we were working, we were also pushing in the government areas, in politics. I remember we pushed for the Deputy Speaker of Parliament. We pushed for Electoral Commission to have women. So people were getting tired of these groups, and in Bantu language there is a prefix where you put boo and you are belittling whoever it is. So the saying was, we are tired of these Akford women. And that is, but then we were doing some work, and the department actually came about because of that push. The other area there where we can learn from that, there are other influencers, not just the drivers, those who are driving the idea. There were other components which influenced the growth and the founding of this institution. You recall that at the time in the 80s and 90s, in the development field, there was the push for gender, at first women and development, but also later for gender and development. There were individuals. I want to go into those in the Western world. You have heard of Esther Bozorap, who was talking about women's contribution in economic development. There were buzzwords about gender trainings, gender sensitivity, gender responsiveness, and bodies like Oxfam, Action Aid, UN Women were all pushing for that. So that helped to make the atmosphere or the environment conducive for establishing and supporting this department. And the Beijing Conference of 1995, which many of you have heard of, was also a turning point because it also helped the government of Uganda to be in line with what was happening in the world. In fact, the government of Uganda, having signed all these conventions, we could use it against them if they didn't really act. So all those things helped to make the environment important. And I won't go in details, but the government of Uganda has many other areas of affirmative action that helped this crusade. But there were also individuals, as the department was moving, was doing her own work in the Faculty of Law. We had Margaret Mangeni doing the similar work in the Faculty of Agriculture. We had Professor Ruth Mukama in Humanities, Christine Dranzoa, Mero Kwakol, they were doing that in science. It wasn't just the department. It was a push from different angles. So these were the lessons. In this particular case, my lessons are two. In this particular case, you seize the moment. This is how we seize the moment when there was this whole positivity about gender and women's studies. Then we seize that moment. The second is to build networks. There were all these networks that we were using. Then move to another area of male champions. We couldn't do all this without the support of the leadership, male leaders. After all, many of them on top were actually male leaders. I've mentioned Professor Kidia, who helped us to be on the agenda. Professor Opio Eperu, he was the Deputy Vice Chancellor. He helped us a lot. Whenever we had any problem of no entry, we would run it to him. In fact, at one time he used to call three of us. One of them, Grace Bantebia, is she still here? Dr. Grace Bantebia, myself, and Ruth Mukama. At one time we were pushing for a minute of the council to say that of the three top positions in Makerere University, one of them must be a woman. And this is how we did that kind of work. So, male champions, already we have mentioned Professor Rugujo. Thank you for your push. This is a success story, but the lessons we learned from it is that the numbers matter. Visibility matters, because if there are no numbers, then we can't move on. And then recognition must be, I say not recognition, but actually the push must be multi-pronged. But I also want to say that actually when there is success, if it is a success story, you don't have to say it too much, you also get visitors. That's how the department was able to get NORAD to give it money. I'm trying to wind up, Sarah. So, to what extent women and gender studies is accepted is something that I must talk about. Although it is a success story, we need to reflect. Can we say that this discipline is acceptable, is accepted everywhere? We need to reflect on that. And I want to give a few examples to say that we still need to work very hard about this issue, because I don't think you can just say we are fully accepted. Dean. One example, there was a time when there was disagreement about the leadership of the department. And the person who was running the elections, the academic registrar, said, do you know that we can close this department? Don't think you are mathematics or physics or what, because we can cross you and distribute many of you to your parent disciplines. That is the kind of thing which happens. Then when there were the creation of colleges, Mr. Vice Chancellor, there was a threat to say women and gender studies actually gender is a cross-cutting issue, so we don't need a school. So you need to keep aware of those kinds of statements. I mentioned the minutes of where we had council agreed to have that policy about leadership, but the minute disappeared completely. It is not in the books of the university. So what does that mean? The last bit is that the gender and gender studies, women's studies, is not listed among the priority areas of the government of Uganda. The Ministry of Education has a list of disciplines that they regard as relevant to the planning of the country. This is not there. So we need to reflect on those areas and see what can we do in order to embed gender studies fully in this area. So the lesson is there are traces of lip service. The new ideologies and methodologies are required so that we can overcome these. I had examples, but I won't go through them because of time. And I can just summarize with what can we do then, just a few suggestions. First of all, we need a tracer study if we haven't done it, so that we can know where our many graduates, where they have been and what they are doing. Research and publications. We need to do what you introduced at the very beginning, Dean, about local situations. But for me, my dream, which so far, according to the rate that is happening, it may not happen in my lifetime, but in order to understand our societies, we still need to know the past, and we have not really looked up to the past. In terms of everyday life, whether it is the rituals of birth or death or marriage, division of labor, the different groupings, the different communities, even just within Uganda or with Africa in particular, we don't have that. And we need it in order to understand where we come from, particularly as women. And who is publishing, that one you have already mentioned, and I want to recognize the people who are from the diaspora, because they are doing themselves a bit of that more than we are maybe here, but we need to look at how we can situate ourselves here, as you mentioned. And one of the weak areas is lack of longitudinal research, because if we had it, we would be able to trace some of these things. I'm not going to talk about Africanness. I had listed it. It is the work of CODESRIA, and it is related also to these gender studies. What is special? And special in that you mentioned that we shouldn't have African gender studies and all that, but I think we have a special area there. For example, the fact that we combine practical or theory and practice, we combine theorists, we combine practitioners, and we have other forums like the African Feminist Forum, where I know Professor Tamale is very active. We should embrace all these, which are very different from the studies outside of Africa. So we need to see how we deal with this. We need to see how we deal with our power centers. But above all, I want to say that gender and women's studies still requires marketing. It still requires activism. we still have to do that if we have got to make it, I think, be stable. So in conclusion, women and gender studies have helped to legitimize the notions of gender equity and equality. Through the work of the school, we have trained many cadres whom we hope have influenced society. But gender studies still require a conducive institutional environment so that all the students and staff feel they are part of the institution, and we need to continue enrolling the supporters. I'd like to say, as I conclude, the door is still ajar, we haven't reached there. And also to say the intergenerational strategy is very, very important. We need to keep a thread. In the Western world, they say, never forget your mothers. That's what they say in the women's movement. I'm glad that I'm still in that thread. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what I was just saying is that one of the key people Professor Kwesiga was pushing with is Professor Edith Natukunda Tokboa. She was one of those behind the formation of the school, and she's interpreting for French in the both. And also just to say, just a point of correction, that we are advocating for centering African knowledge, to center as not just with the prefix of African knowledge, but to center it within the body of the academy. Thank you very much. So over to you, Pinky.
Thank you very much. Obviously, a difficult act to follow. Professor Kwesiga, let me extend gratitude to the organizers that saw it fit for me to accompany Professor Kwesiga. Professor Kwesiga is many things to many people, as you've heard, but she was always somebody that I could call on whenever I needed to reflect on the work that I was doing around gender programming at CODESRIA. I am still very grateful that you always would listen and you always would come. And it is a great pleasure to meet you after some 20 years of us not coming together at any platform whatsoever. Part of the reason for that is that after CODESRIA, I went in many different directions. I am Pinky Mekwe. I'm from Botswana. My country wasn't called out, so let me say. And I am now the COO at Africa Health Research Institute, based in South Africa, Durban specifically, but also with a campus in Somkele in Duba. We serve communities that are diverse, and our campuses reflect that. One is right in the middle of Durban at UKZN School of Medicine, while the other one is within the community. And we work very well as researchers that focus on health, but also look to intervene and ensure that there is as much assistance and support as possible for those that need health intervention, health and wellness for the most needy of our societies. I'm also an honorary senior research fellow at University College London, so I do still have one leg in the research arena, though not as active as one could be when one is doing much more of the work of institution building. And you'll see how this links up with CODESRIA as I speak about my CODESRIA experience. Gratitude too for this opportunity for reflection, but especially for shared reflection. Because when you work behind the scenes, when you are the person that facilitates meetings of this nature, when you are part of the team that looks at seeking to chart the agenda, really, for research, you hardly ever have enough time, if at all you do get it, for shared reflection, especially with the people that matter the most, the scholars, the people that are the engines of the knowledge production that we talk about. And so I'm keen to keep my talk as short as possible, to especially then use this opportunity to hear back. More so that I see in the room a lot of the colleagues that I met some 20 years ago that I worked with over the few years that I spent at CODESRIA. And it would be interesting to hear from them how they experience our intervention as program people at CODESRIA at the time. I started work at CODESRIA as program officer, that's what the PO is for gender, in 2016 in November. As program officer, I had other things that were thrown onto my portfolio. And so I wasn't just focused on gender as such. I looked also after the humanities and was in fact brought in to establish the gender program as such, a standalone gender program for CODESRIA, established the humanities program for CODESRIA, run comparative research networks across the continent, run national working groups across the continent, run a South-South partnership. At the time, it was primarily with CLACSO in Latin America, and also with an Asia partner. Run our main North-South partnership with Canadians primarily at the time, HSRC, because at the time Southern Africa wasn't very well represented in CODESRIA, but also to lead what were called special initiatives, strategic interventions. For example, we needed to go back to supporting AWOOD. You've heard about how AWOOD was incubated at CODESRIA, and in fact, one could argue was the foundation for gender programming at CODESRIA. Go to UNESCO and set up a strategic partnership there around, in particular, policy. And our main vehicle for doing that was trade, specifically cross-border trade, which is an area that primarily has women as the most active population. And also, of course, the HSRC initiative was meant to broaden our entry into Southern Africa and reinvigorate that as such. Now, a program officer is usually selected on the basis of their value-add potential for the intellectual programming within the institution. However, the logistics can bog you down immensely. The logistics, therefore, mean that what you often hear complaints. We will complain. Like I came in this morning and all I wanted to do was complain about how I wasn't met. And this is the kind of feedback that often you get as a program officer. And you often don't have enough time to really hear about the critical matters, the programming itself. What should we be doing? Or you might get fleeting compliments. But my point here is that it's really usually situational. So when you get, what you get to do as a program officer on an everyday basis is really a true exercise in a lived, continuous balancing act. You get to deal with budgets. You also have to make sure that you have your ideas. You do your idea selling within the institution, outside the institution. Once your ideas have been adopted within the institution, you would have heard from the scientific committee members, for instance. There'll come a point when you then have to sell the ideas to the scientific committee. Ideas on the strategy, the content, the direction, Will they buy this? Always a headache for a program officer. Even then, once the strategy has been taken up, when it comes to execution, you still have to work across with your team, across with your colleagues, across with your seniors, and then of course externally with partnerships, your partners, the relationships that you cultivate. This is much more so for gender programming, because if there is one area that dictates that you cannot work in silo format, it is gender. It is all-encompassing. It has to be at the center of everything that we do. And when you get asked to be the first person to set up a program for an institution like CODESRIA that had been in existence for over 30 years at that point, there is a lot to contend with. There's also the issue of context. You come into an institution for you to be able to sell these ideas, for you to be able to get support, assistance, for you to be able to get the budget for all that you feel ought to be done. What is the mood within? But also, are you reading the pulse right on the ground? Because as I said, the very scholars that you serve are so important. They're critical to everything that you do. They're critical to the success of anything. You can come up with whatever thematics. If people are not interested because somehow it does not speak to them, then essentially you're on your own. Who's going to come and do the talking? Who is going to be interested? Is this something that is of import that could actually have impact beyond the rooms that we sit in, which is what really does drive people to do the work that we do. So these are all things then that you always have to think about. The human resources, what do you have at your disposal? What timelines do you have? How much time do you actually have? And for an institution as comprehensive as CODESRIA, you have to take things from concept all the way through to publishing, up to the point when you can actually have your executive secretary hand over these books that you should be proud of. So the context internally and externally is key to what is doable, to what is achievable, whether in fact real impact will be realized. For me, I would say then, therefore, that my experiences at CODESRIA are very closely intertwined with where the institution was at the time that I joined. The institution had gone through some, as all institutions do. Institutions tend to go into valleys, go over to hills. You hear of a lull where there wasn't enough noise that was coming out of CODESRIA. When I came in at the time that I did in 2006, there had been some past bruising, especially around the gender possibility of a gender program. As I said, there was already work that was being done, but not structured into a standalone gender program, as a lot of the writers, the activists, the researchers on gender on the continent, including Professor Bunwari over there, who had been senior program officer and is a gender specialist, they didn't feel that enough was being done. So you come in with this, past bruising too, because the institution had almost collapsed at some point. And we were now on a trajectory where it was going up. It was going up with this fairly limited gendered content, even though the content that was there was powerful. A word, as I said, had been incubated and had actually, in fact, been critical to also shaping me and my studies when I was doing my doctoral studies at Sussex. Was when I actually first came across a word, and I learned a lot from that. So it was a good thing too that I was passionate about the institution, in part because I felt that it had already shaped me, and I was keen to also go in and do something, hopefully contribute. And so going in, questions were, do we broaden the scope? But as you broaden the scope, you also want to, at the same time, deepen the intellectual quality and debate. You want to reinvigorate and re-energize the area of gender. Do we harness broader issues within the institution? Because as I indicated, I see the 5. As I indicated, there was a lot of work that had already been done in the social sciences, and there had not been concerted effort at structuring into the social sciences, the humanities, and gender. Do you extend the scholarship in such a manner that you also ensure that you broaden the community? Because as you've heard, CODESRIA is very clear about inclusivity, about gender representation, about representation in geographical terms, about cross-generational representation, language representation. You have to pull all of these in. Solicit and get support behind the vision that was coming up, and ensure that, yes, everybody gets excited about gender. So this, both entrenching and widening at the same time, was no walk in the park. But for me, it was serendipitous in that here was an institution that was keen and driven to change, to grow, to challenge, to reach out, to include, to support, to redefine, to do a whole lot of things that meant charting new paths upon the old, to revitalize Pan-Africanism in its multifacetedness through knowledge, while ensuring that gender is and becomes, as it were, its heartbeat. I'd say that a key moment in the journey that I walked at CODESRIA in that 3 years was the 2007 gender planning meeting that I felt it necessary to hold with as broad a spectrum of gender scholars and activists and researchers across the continent, together with CODESRIA. One would say this was a storming and a watershed moment, because thereafter we did begin to walk the path of norming. We asked all the critical questions. What? We brought out all of the linen also from the past. There were essentially fights on the floor. The what's, the where's, the how and when, the who and how the funding goes, why it is that CODESRIA for the first time says that it has somebody that will look after gender programming, and yet they have a portfolio that suggests that they're just another program officer after all. So they actually, this person didn't come in on the gender ticket. So all of that needed to be threshed out. It was, and beyond that, we did work on issues of human resourcing. CODESRIA joined in with us and put in funds to allow for the programming to actually grow. We got 2 gender managers to work with me. We're able to do a whole lot of work, a lot of which I am going to simply skip over. Important to point out. The gender symposia, we worked hand in glove with the Africa Arab Research Center in Cairo. It was a deliberate move towards inclusivity to ensure that African gender debates and discussions keep taking place in an area on the continent that requires much more engagement. So we did the symposia absolutely consistently over the 3 years that I was there, together with the Institute, absolutely every single time. But what I ensured we also did was to infuse the humanities within this as a mode too of expanding the programming. And so for the first time, we were dealing with issues such as gender and slavery, gender and football. Gender was infused across pretty much everything. It became almost overwhelming for me because I had to make sure that I look through absolutely everything for every single activity that took place. It was not enough. It was not ready to go off if it hadn't gone past the gender officer to see that there was representation, there were gender thematics, things were covered, and all of that. And we continued also to ensure that we infuse gender into Child Institute, gender and health also got coverage, gender and politics, gender and the economy, all of that. I dare say, towards conclusion, the chair isn't particularly happy with me. That I feel that by the time I concluded my work, the vision had crystallized, the foundation had solidified, much as I had actually gotten a lot of pushback for some of the new areas of engagement. We put a lot into film and performance and made sure that we were present in Ouagadougou every other year. As for the football and gender, it was a problem that even when we had a strategy meeting with the scientific committee, they said, but what is this all about? The really interesting thing is ultimately when they did get convinced that it was worth doing, it became one of it was actually the biggest. I think to date, it is yet to be beaten. It brought together also a whole array of new voices that we had not ever come across at CODESRIA. So much so that it had to actually later be followed up with a full institute. And so, yes, you do have to come with a disruptive mind when you come from a gender perspective, and it does pay off to push, but to also have allies like Professor Bo, like Professor Kwesiga, people that you can call on and get assistance. The first time I met the current executive secretary of CODESRIA was the same time I met Professor Ahekere, and it was at the CODESRIA Gender Symposium. This is one executive secretary, therefore, that I know it doesn't just pay lip service to gender. He doesn't come into these meetings just because he's the executive secretary, but because he himself has been a gender scholar for years on end. I think an attestation of the crystallization of the work of gender programming at CODESRIA was probably the 2008 General Assembly. Perhaps for the very first time, there was not a single panel across that whole assembly that did not have a gender thematic, that did not have gender representation, that did not also have the humanities represented. In fact, the keynote speaker that we had approached was the late Amartha Aidu, who just passed on, may her soul rest in peace. And when she couldn't come, our keynote became Tsitsi Dangaremba. So, powerful female keynote to not just showcase the work of gender, but to simply do the right thing. These are people that we need to listen to that had not necessarily always been centered. Now, I want to conclude with the notion of the personal is political. I'm a true creation of CODESRIA myself, soberly Pan-African. I have become an institution builder in the work that I do, that I have done post-CODESRIA, primarily because of the work that I did at CODESRIA. So it's an institution that allows you to grow. I'm also pitching in here for CODESRIA, for especially the younger folk that might want to walk these steps. My research was actually, and I bring this up because this came up this morning, on African feminisms. So it's interesting how these issues of naming keep coming up. And of course, they are worth dealing with as and when they come up. The passion also to impact communities and make a difference within our continent, I link directly to the work that I did at CODESRIA, such that when I left, I was able to do work that is so diverse because I had access to inclusive networks, and so I could work in internationalization. I could work in politics and policy. The work that I did with the IDEA, including the setting up of the Women in Politics program there. And now the work that I do with the Africa Health Research Institute, that also includes traditional medicine programming, where often we have been told that we tend to pay lip service to issues of culture and tradition, history. The positive steps that I have taken, I also link to the issues of identity that I was able to thresh out and that made me feel very proud to be African, that come directly from the work that I did with CODESRIA and all the different people that I met there. And so a personal reconciliation then that one finds between a Western education and our traditional culture and beliefs is the kind of person that can come out of working with CODESRIA, engaging with the work of CODESRIA. And finally, some of the lessons that I'd say I took away around research programming are that leadership is key. That one also needs to work against silos. Partnerships, therefore, are key. The researcher is queen. Consistency, relevance, impact, inclusivity, being disruptive. But much more important, perhaps, than anything else that I have learned primarily at CODESRIA is a mindset of service. Stepping down your own interest, for instance, in research, for the higher ideal, for ensuring that you support the research of others on the continent to ensure that African knowledge production is real. Thank you.
I'm going to accept only 2 questions, one for each panelist. Otherwise, thank you very much for our great panel. And as the questions are coming, mine is just a plea to all of you. Shall we see a day where we teach Ifya Madiome and teach Oyewumi Oyeronke as feminism, not just as African feminism? Because after all, when we teach Mary Wollstonecraft, we don't say we are teaching British feminism. When we teach Betty Friedan, we don't say we are teaching American feminism. We just teach liberal feminism, and we say Mary Wollstonecraft, Betty Friedan. Then when we come to Oyewumi and we come to Ifya Madiome, we say it's African feminism. That's my contention.
CODESRIA, something related, because I feel like you're talking about something that is actually should be done in our place, in my place actually. So I don't know whether you've reached that side or it wasn't well included.
The ED has noted. When he comes up, we'll answer whether he's in Sudan, because this thing should be actually in Sudan. Why is he in other places? Any other question? Yes, one more question.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Walter Chambati from Zimbabwe. I have a question for Professor Kwesiga. You highlight that the formation of the school also relied on mobilization of support of the women's movement. Yeah, given the diversity, at least from where I'm coming from, the diverse interests amongst the women's movement, how did you unify the different class interests for the rural women? Mostly women's movements in many places are dominated by women within the urban, those who could more or less considered to be middle class. In driving this agenda, how did you unify this diverse interest across the women's movement? Thank you.
In fact, I had that statement in my write-up, but about there is always that I call it a diversion or excuse whenever you are doing something, you want to uplift a group of women. Here we are academicians. Then they're asking you, why do you want women's studies? What have you done for rural women? That is always the question, but you have to start somewhere. Because when you do the work of gender studies, what is doing and is doing its work and is going the research that they do, and I mentioned that there is this important connection between development and the academic work. So you can do both, but we are always diverted by saying, what have you done for rural women? My mother is here, you haven't done anything about her. I call them diversionary because we have to focus on what, you can't do everything at the same time. But it doesn't mean that you have forgotten. Part of it is policy. The policies that we have, for example, the issue in Uganda, we had some focus on rural women in terms of the kind of loans that they give and the groupings that you make. There are ways in which you can come to these levels when you are also at the academic level, because you are training people. We can't do everything at a go.
Maybe just to add on to that, some of these distinctions are imaginary. The imagination that middle-class women and rural women, there's nothing in between them. So let's be aware of that too. So I would like to call upon the ED of CODESRIA, and as he comes, he's going to perform a function, but in addition to that function, he will also explain, CODESRIA deserves to be in Sudan. Why aren't you in the Sudan? Thank you.
Yeah, I owe too many African countries a presence. So we summarized it in the notion of a Pan-African reach. And actually Sudan was represented on the executive committee of CODESRIA until 2018. Let me learn. We've published on South Sudan. We were a part of the discussions that culminated into the referendum. And we have publications on South Sudan, including convened South Sudanese scholars, right? Including Professor Wasara, Taban Leliong, in the reflections that we've had. And often I feel that part of the challenge is not so much that we're not reaching out. Part of the challenge is that people are not reaching out to us. The publication of South Sudan is free of charge on our website. I don't have the statistics now, but if you ask me, because all our programming is by competitive blind peer review process. I can tell you how many applications per year we receive on any of the programs from South Sudan. But I don't think that's the best approach in this case. I think the best approach is we're doing a lot more to reach out, and we're going to do a lot more in terms of outreach and encourage colleagues in South Sudan to reach out. Because we are charting a new course as we go forward beyond in our 50th anniversary and beyond. So reach out to us through the website. There's details. You can reach out to our colleague, and if there are areas we can work on, we can. There is a dominance of South Sudanese participation in CODESRIA who are in the diaspora. So that's what we need to turn back. So that's really my preliminary response. But we can't grow by taking away from Cairo to South Sudan. We can grow by multiplying our presence in all those spaces. And that's our commitment. Okay. Thank you. But I have a very small little thing I would like to do. I don't know how many people have ever seen me carry this thing. Everywhere we've gone, in the last 2 to 3 years, we've tried to leave a presence, an emblem of CODESRIA, if you will, among those people who have made a significant contribution to the community of scholarship in CODESRIA. The last time I had an opportunity to do that, it was with Professor Pendambo in Dakar when we had a meeting in March last year, because she self-identifies as a CODESRIA militant and has unapologetically been involved in helping CODESRIA in good and bad times. And I wanted to make known publicly that Professor Mbo is one of the significant militants. The other one that I think we have been looking for and the opportunity did not present itself is Professor Joy Kwesiga. Professor Joy Kwesiga's militancy is slightly different from Pendambo's militancy, but it's militancy anyway for CODESRIA. In line with the tradition that we have established at CODESRIA, we wanted to leave this token of appreciation, which essentially just is an appreciation for your contribution to CODESRIA, and I could not find a better person to deliver this message on my behalf than Pingi Mehwe, who was in charge of the CODESRIA program when you started involving yourself centrally in CODESRIA. So I'm going to hand over Pingi this to give it to you in appreciation for your contribution.
So a round of applause to the eminent panel. And another applause to yourselves for being so patient. And thank you very much. And I encourage you to remain patient in your seats for the next panel because it has very interesting panelists. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last panel this evening. As my panelists take their seats, I want to introduce them very quickly because we've already lost time. I'm Florence Sebila from the School of Women and Gender Studies, and I'll be moderating this panel. Penda Mbo has already been introduced as CODESRIA militant. She's one of our panelists. She's going to talk to us this afternoon. She's a historian by profession and has done a lot of research on Muslim medieval history, African intellectual history, and Islamic gender studies. She has taught and held fellowships in several universities, including Uppsala, Sweden. I hope that's you I'm introducing, and Boston. And right now, she is the president of Citizens Movement in Senegal. We all know what has been happening in Senegal today, and we want to hope that this is not going to turn out into something chaotic, and we want her to feel comfortable and talk to us about her presentation. We also have our second panelist, Danae Mupotsa. Danae, you'll excuse me if I don't pronounce your name very well. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of African Literature at Witwatersrand and a published poet. Mupotsa's research intersects race, sex, gender, and intimacies. She is a committed feminist, queer and anti-racist political and pedagogical praxis scholar, and she dutifully attends to the study of theories that theories of affect, psychoanalysis, materialism, space, temporalities, and development. And our third panelist is Professor Sylvia Tamale, who is very well known to us. We are very happy to have you back with us after a few months of retirement. She was one of the first deans of the School of Law here at Makerere University. She founded and was the coordinator of Gender, Law, and Sexuality Research Project at the School of Law. She has done so many things. She's an accomplished scholar, a human rights activist, and she continues to do a lot of amazing things. By the way, Professor Sylvia Tamale, we are still waiting for that book on decolonization. It's out of stock. We still really need them in our scholarship. These are the panelists that you have before us. Since we don't have much time, I don't want to take a lot of time with introductions. We were supposed to take 20 minutes each. I request that you take 15 minutes each in your presentations. If you can take less, that would be wonderful. And I would request the audience to be patient with us. So without wasting much time, I would like to invite the first presenter, and that will be Professor Sylvia Tamale, to give us her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. When my son, 20-something-year-old, looked through the program for today, he creased his brow and said, what's this? Towards a feminist insurrection, constructing epistemic antecedents. So, is that Greek? So I want to begin by breaking down the big words in the thematic title of this panel. At CODESRIA, you need to be accessible to everyone. Insurrection ordinarily refers to revolt or revolution or rebellion, but my understanding of its use here is that it is talking about arriving at a feminist awareness. And what exactly does constructing epistemic antecedents mean in the language of a layperson? Again, in this context, constructing actually means uncovering, and epistemic antecedents refers to what I call the big lie. The term epistemic comes from the philosophical concept, epistemology, which refers to the acquisition of knowledge. So it's about knowing and other truth-related practices. How do we know what we know? How do we know that small eyes and big nostrils are indicators of ugliness? Where did we get the truth that John Speke discovered the source of the Nile in 1858? Why do we teach our children that A is for apple when that fruit is alien to our continent? How come we associate development with whiteness and underdevelopment with blackness? And why do we associate power with men and not with women? So basically, this panel attempts to uncover the big lie about African women and African men, to uncover the disfiguration and instrumentalization of dangerous narratives that continue to drive structures of untruths about gender relations in Africa, to articulate the connections between gender justice and geopolitical power relations. How can we stop the trafficking of the series of lies encoded in our colonial subjectivities? What and how is gender theory on the continent guided in its emancipatory practices? And what assumptions remain unexamined? So very briefly, I want to focus on one of the many structures that the big lie has constructed and sustained. I discussed the concept of gender as a mechanism through which colonial norms and beliefs become embedded in hegemonic ordering. The world is living one big lie. A big lie with many spin-offs That lie has been successfully spun by imperialist powers over centuries. The lie is that on planet Earth, there is one universal correct way of being human. The lie constructs the Western way of thinking, of being, and of doing as a one-size-fits-all model, the default drive for the entire world. It mandates universal conformity to Western ways of understanding and interpreting the world. This includes education, governance, development, measuring time, quality of life, and so on. As is true for all untruths, the big lie is spread through the power of language and discourse. Through tools such as religion, law, education, and mass media, colonialists constructed narratives of the naturalness of white supremacy and black inferiority, male supremacy and female inferiority, heteronormativity, and so on. During the second half of the 20th century, the imperialists appeared to retreat from Africa with the formal lowering of colonial flags at ceremonial independence parades. However, they had utilized 7.5 decades of colonial rule to firmly entrench the lie through the globalization of Western values, norms, and knowledge, all in the name of civilizing the dark continent. During this time, they systematically put in place structures and mechanisms that sustained their domination, even after losing physical administration of their erstwhile colonies. Today, the colonial machinery has successfully woven a totalizing ideology that penetrates all aspects of African lives. Through knowledge production and dissemination, this machinery exercises influential and insidious forms of hegemonic power, hence sustaining the world economic order. The concept of gender. The cultural systems that order African understandings of gender are so fundamentally alien to Western ways of thinking that they appear irrational. While colonial paradigms of gender are firmly founded on polarized dualisms of man-woman, African indigenous understandings of the same were more pluralistic, more elastic, and more accommodating. Rigid gender dualisms create blind spots and stereotypes that result in social inequalities and injustices. For example, intersex, transgender, and other non-conforming individuals who do not fit into the neat sex markers of male or female end up being erased from state policies and subjected to multiple types of stigma and discrimination. Scholars of history and gender have challenged colonial gender tropes, revealing many examples from African societies where the organization of gender was not necessarily arranged along heterosexual or patriarchal lines. In her classic book, Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Ifi Amadiume explains that biological sex did not always correspond to ideological gender in the Igbo Nobi community in southeastern Nigeria. In most African cosmologies, the dead transcend into the spirit world and live on among the living as living ancestors. Ancestors may use any living body, regardless of sex, as conduits to exercise their agency through possession. This is why the equivalence of Western secular notions of transgenderism and homosexuality were not unthinkable in African ontological and epistemic framings. The ancestral power of the Sangomas of South Africa and their full-fledged transgender statuses are but one example of this. So, although patriarchy existed prior to the colonial invasions of Africa, its inner workings were quite different from those of Victorian-era patriarchy.
The latter was heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian and natural law traditions, and philosophically defined by Cartesian dualisms. In contrast, the relative flexibility of indigenous gender systems made it possible for women to perform male roles in terms of power and authority over others. And because roles were not rigidly masculinized or feminized, no stigma was attached to breaking gender rules. Examples abound that exhibited such gender bending across the continent. I don't have time to go through the list. When colonialists arrived here, they proceeded to impose their own conceptualizations of gender onto African communities in order to fit into the imperatives of capitalist production and reproduction. Hence, they flattened the experiences of Africans for their own ends. Indeed, gender and the related concepts of sexuality and gender identity are intractably linked with and pivotal to the capitalist accumulation process. Where there had been a fusion between the public and the private social spheres, colonialism proceeded to restructure spaces, clearly separating the market and the legal political structure that props it up from the domestic home. The dualisms are further entrenched in the corresponding binary characterizations of the gendered spaces as productive and unproductive, waged and unwaged, self-interest, altruism. The foundational construction of men as productive breadwinners and women as unproductive caretakers further creates a gender hierarchy that subordinates women. It did not resonate with most African societies, where many women routinely engaged in trade, commerce, agriculture, construction, and control of property prior to the interventions of the colonialists. With the colonial restructuring of gender relations, women's undervalued and unremunerated labor in homes, farms, and communities worked to subsidize capital by enabling it to cut the costs of maintaining wage earners, hence enhancing its profit margin. When you analyze the current state of knowledge about gender in Africa, it becomes very clear that the history and cultures that inform present knowledge are manipulated and skewed at best, or completely erased at worst. Our tendency is to produce knowledge about the marginalized and not knowledge with and from the perspectives of those othered in dominant discourse. The totalizing logic and silencing effect of dominant discourses have left the voices of Africans who are marginalized clamoring to be included within the history that informs the present. They certainly offer alternative discourses of gender, of being, and of thinking. We see examples of such alternative discourses in the amazing decolonial research undertaken by some African feminist storytellers, such as Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi in her classic novels Chintu and The First Woman. All this should give feminists on the continent serious pause to begin interrogating how the neoliberal structuring conditions and rationalities of present-day gender ideologies have formed strange bedfellows with conservative champions like Honorable Asumani Basalirwa, who recently sponsored the anti-homosexuality bill here in Uganda and is supported by many people who identify as gender activists. To conclude, until knowledge is dislodged from its colonial roots and rerouted into African communities, excavating the wealth of African histories and experiences, the continent will never step out of the grim trap of neocolonialism and coloniality. Radical changes of a revolutionary nature need to take place within African academies and knowledge production processes in order to achieve the epistemic rupture with Western hegemonic dominance. The deeply rooted colonial legacy of epistemic violence towards African worldviews and its people require a total reorientation of scholarship and knowledge production. Violence is a key structural function of maintaining the exploitative conditions under which women work. Given that knowledge represents the power of the dominant, decolonizing knowledge production challenges us to completely transcend the colonizing boundaries of modernist discourse and to think outside the box, freely and creatively, to look beyond the common and the obvious. When one sweeps the theoretical and intellectual landscape of African feminisms today, one finds that it continues to share its fundamentals with the Western canon of thought, based on an abstract universal. As African feminists, we need to adopt a pluralistic epistemic toolbox that is derived from a critical dialogue between diverse African perspectives in order to gain fresh insights, using tools that are derived from a plurality of Ubuntu imaginings of feminisms. Unlearning Eurocentric thinking processes is the main challenge of the day. Africa needs to take seriously its traditional epistemologies that were devalued and eroded by colonialism. Not only must we value theories developed out of formal academies, but also those that emanate from the unschooled. Decolonized knowledge should thus take into account diversities based on gender, socioeconomic status, age, sexualities, disability, and so on, as well as all intersectional injustices. The continent should also caution itself about the risk of institutionalizing decolonial African thoughts as the new hegemonic power. The so-called specialized epistemic communities should not replace indigenous knowledge. Processes of knowledge production must remain organic, constantly renewing themselves. So in order to overcome the Berlin-engineered balkanization of the continent and gain leverage over the hegemonic world order, Africa needs to establish a massive youth-led counterweight through a Pan-African grounds-up movement led by a clear decolonial ideology. Youth-led because they have the least to lose and everything to gain by changing A is for Apple to A is for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've saved 2 minutes, precise and onto the point. That's why I didn't even attempt to define some of the terms or to introduce the topic, because I saw insurrection and I saw antecedents and I said, okay, they'll handle their topic themselves. This is really English. But it's really calling for revolution. It's calling for decolonization. It's not going to come on a silver platter. May I invite the next presenter? I don't know whether you want to use the podium or you want to sit and talk. From there you'll come. Please, you're welcome to make your presentation.
Thank you so much, Madame Présidente. Merci beaucoup. J'aurais bien aimé parler en anglais.
Thank you. I would
pour
love
que
to speak in English
tout le monde puisse
so that
suivre.
everyone can follow
Et je
really
me
well.
sens-
But I find myself well to speak in French, so maybe it should have been better to use Wolof so that I express my ideas very well. I would like to thank Godwin and all the staff of CODESRIA. From the time I've been in CODESRIA, I was a very young assistant with my friend, Tadeo. That was in the 1990s. We were in the governance sector. We have never left CODESRIA from that time. Because for me, that is one of the biggest achievements for our continent. And I believe that our heads of states, the AU, should really take it on so that they can fund, maybe they be the funders for these efforts. Because this is an organization that needs support. Because no one is going to do that. No one can develop society, especially at the continent level, without this kind of debates. So the relationship that you have with Kampala, I think this is an ordinary relationship. The first time I came to Kampala, that was in 1992, for the African Leadership Forum that was organized by Obasanjo and with President Museveni. And since then I've come so many other times. One of the biggest moments for CODESRIA, that was also during the conference on the academic freedom that we had in Kampala. And also the Declaration of Kampala and the reference text for the whole African Academy, the university, for the researchers and the scholars. To come back to my reflection this afternoon, we're talking about the feminist reflection. If we are to have social transformation, I saw a paper by Patricia Maxia that is very inspiring for me, because it is the same process that I compare myself with her. As you know, we cannot talk about this feminist when we don't have detailed intellectual debates. And I think our trajectory has been determined basically by an intellectual heritage that is well anchored, that started in the 1940s with the African presence and with the generation of African presence that I consider as our ancestors. Those generations where we find political thoughts, political scholars, the big historians, and there were great thinkers like Leopold Senghor and Césaire. And these are people who mentored us that we had to follow. And my intellectual conscience and my way of thinking is based on that kind of, without kind of roots. I have to make sure that I pay attention to what I say as a human being, but also as a woman in my society. That's the first issue. And I was also, I can say I was born with the Conference of Bantu, then so the African independence. And with this kind of context, and we are questioning these perspectives, I cannot say, I cannot just remain silent. All this at one time, at an intellectual level, when we are determining our feminist vision and our society that is equal, I owe it to a certain context. When I was getting the doctorate at the University of Cluj, the discourse that was presented by a philosopher in Dakar, there was something that was very important for me. He said that I couldn't have existed in a country other than Senegal, because that is the intellectual context. I was just talking about our former scholars who were well rooted in the country. We're talking about CODESRIA and other organizations who have all benefited. The second issue is being aware of area studies. What should I do as a woman? What should I be as a woman? For instance, they were saying that in my society, in my community, as someone who is claiming for feminist rights, my feminism is first of all working on my intellect. right from high school, I said I was going to do history, medieval history, because I wanted to understand in detail the evolution of human society. And by doing medieval history, I looked at medieval history of African history, European history, Islamic history, to understand the different civilizations, the Western civilization, the Islamic civilization, but also anchored in the African civilization. Apart from that, when I was a student, I started asking myself different questions and reflecting, why, for instance, why do you have a lot of justice? Why is society divided? Why is it that the women were finding themselves in a situation where they are always putting, during the marriage ceremonies, during the family gatherings, the women, they're always some injustice. I was already asking myself questions while I was in primary school. So we're able to understand this evolution, and we saw the need to have transformation of our own society. And from 1977, I was in the second year at university, and the first fight, it was really a political fight without a political party. I started with me, and to make sure that we come to understand this real structure. I knew all the politicians in Senegal and without the Senegal. Between primary and high school, I knew all of them, the different political parties. I knew Leopold Sédar Senghor and all in primary even, and many other politicians, even Elamide, because I knew that when I was still in primary. So it was very interesting. It was awakening my conscience to understand why is it that our society is divided, and asking the question why. And most of the problems that I realized, the challenge was when I wanted to start Islamic studies in the Department of History. It was a very big challenge. Because our colleagues, the men, and also the students were saying, how can a woman study and teach Islam in an Islamic country? And the answer I gave them, how I imposed myself, there was no other solution, there was no other challenge. It was just about having knowledge, full stop. Once you have the knowledge, it was my arm, my tool to fight against this injustice so that I can be included in the Islamic studies. And I did not stop at teaching, maybe putting on the Sharia and everything, and also working on feminism within Islam. And I took authors like Fatima, who were very important in my vision of how I was working. At that time when I was teaching, there were some other opportunities that gave me an opportunity to analyze, examine my society, and I saw we should understand better Islam and make sure that we have this construction so that we don't leave women and exclude them from public spaces, but also we needed to support them to make sure that they get this knowledge, because they're saying women should not touch the Quran, they are not clean, they should not study all this. So we needed to have that kind of feminist interpretation so that we can understand in our context, in the society, Senegalese society. I didn't stop at that. Right from the time when I was a student up to today, one of the themes we talk about is the defense for secular defense. It's something that we need space that is neutral, public space for a society that is multicultural, multi-religious, a society that has multifaceted dimensions. So to fight for that kind of a secular world, it pushed me to understand better the Quran, to understand the Hadith, but also the different interpretations of the different elements. What was this secularism? They were looking at it Said Al-Amini, for example, who worked on secularism within Islam and working with Saigram. I base myself on all those works to understand, to defend this secularism. Without it, we couldn't have had equality within such an Islamic society. So that was one of my way of finding out my existence. Also, the feminist interpretation, developing a society where all men, because all men from Senegal, they know me. I was a fighter. I was an activist. I remember one of the first, I don't know, it was from academic freedom we had with the CODESRIA. There was also the different texts from Islam. I was threatened with death threats. At one time, life was hard, but that one I did not give up, even when I was supposed to be given. I was working even from the Western. I always based myself on the written text to show the evidence. This is what we should do. Okay, I'll just give an example on the concept of this interpretation of feminism. I said, if we use the Quran, there are Surites who are divided. We have the Surites which are short, but also the ones which are Ibad, which are based on the detailed briefs. And where the women, they have the same rights, and they're all based on the Islamic knowledge, but also the beliefs in everything. But when it comes to interpretation about the Surites, I was talking about the Medin Surites when, for instance, the prophets went to Medin. They know the issues of society. If one needed to understand and interpret that the Islam itself could not show. So we had to deconstruct, and all the time I was always in the fight with the religious men, with the journalists on the TV. I think during the 1990s up to 2000, I was working on that theme. I don't have a lot of time. I could not go on, but I did not stop about this reflection. I had to combine what we considered as intellectual expression with the action. Because I believe, and that is my feminist attitude, which also with the society, you cannot do your studies in countries like ours, where knowledge is in the hands of individuals, very few individuals, and you cannot participate in transforming the society. I decided to participate. I committed myself. I was a student. There were issues, for instance, of water. For instance, my mother was having issues with access to water, and it was, I had to call a press brief in Dakar and to fight, and that was the beginning of mobilization to make sure that we have access to water in Senegal, in Dakar. In 1999, after the Mauritanian Revolution, I began a movement, powerful movement. How do you call it? Is it a citizenship whereby we're saying that the people should have their rights, where the women, where the youth were also mobilized. We try to do the cleaning so that we can have a political vision. If I go very fast, I occupy different posts in political. We're talking about transparency in elections, writing against fighting. We're talking about the Islamic Council that wanted to bring the family code and everything. We still forward to make sure that we have equality within society. At the time when there was now a Catholic Church, I wanted to attack the Catholic Church on what I want to call, should I say, a quarrel about the pictures. There's a president who didn't have a religious stand. So after those works, we had to work up to the Pope John Paul II to call for peace in Senegal. I worked so hard on the interreligious dialogue, and when I ended with the creation of the movement for citizenship that we created, and up to now that we share everywhere where we go with this citizenship movement. And we see there is a relationship between the Islamic studies, the feminist movements, all this. I hope I contributed to the contribution to my society, but we should have to continue the fight. There are some challenges we've had, but also we have had to base ourselves on knowledge, and before the feminist feminists will have to work hard to make sure that we come these results. I cannot continue because there is a lot to say, because I don't have enough time, but I hope I'll continue working on such issues. Thank you so much.
But keep your questions. We are coming to the last presenter. May I invite Danai to give her last presentation. Thank you.
Small girl with moths in her mouth, speaks anger in glances, knows the dagger of words. Small girl, big voice, moves in silence, knows how earthquakes begin. In the rumbling of her stomach, entire families collapse. Small girl cares too much for such a small girl. Small girl with treacherous eyes, carries too much feeling in her lungs, knows the sting of lonely. Small girl sees too much, breathes too much, takes up too much air. Small girl is too much mirror and expectation, too much wanting more. Small girl should know better than to try to fight the sun. Small girl with hands of spades, small girl dreams too much, hopes too much, wants to plant and grow. Small girl thinks she is the ocean, small girl is a stream. Small girl will break her heart with all this want. Small girl is not even the wind. Small girl must learn to swallow and be pretty. That's from Wangile Kancho, one of my community's poetry healers also. She's a publisher, an editor. As you've heard from many speakers today, many people who are feminist academics and teachers also occupy multiple or hyphenated identities. And so these are all forms of community. They have a range of languages, epistemic languages themselves. And often that's the requirement for the nature of the work that one intends to do. I'm sitting at a university as a teacher in this case, to situate myself. I was in Makerere once before, and this is how fast time moves. My daughter was still 1, I was still breastfeeding. It's the first time I left her at home, and now she's turning 15, so maybe it won't be so long till the next time I return here. In terms of a feminist classroom, my first feminist classroom was in the year 2000. I was an undergraduate student in the United States. I had been educated in Southern Africa, multiple countries, because of my family moving around. And not once had I read a book by a black person or a woman. I am now in the middle of nowhere in the US, and I was a biology major pre-medical because I'm the oldest child of 3 girls, so I had to do maths. And the biology, I remember in one class, this man says the African bee is dangerous and impulsive, and the European bee somehow is very neutral and is not dangerous. And I asked him about the narrative structure of what he's referring to as science and its background, its disciplinary formation. An 18-year-old, I'm asking this man, he looks confused. You know, the nervous conditions when a woman, no less an African woman, says 2 big words, and then men do this, and they ask what the relevance of your work is. So this man has a moment, and then I registered for courses in Black Studies, this is my background, and Women and Gender Studies at that point. So I've had many experiences that inform what a feminist classroom operates or does and looks like. I end up in South Africa actually with our keynote speaker for tomorrow. We were in the classroom together for postgraduate study at the AGI, African Gender Institute at UCT. We were postgraduate students together, classmates, so our classrooms, even though we live and occupy different territories now of practice, again, another extension of community over time. And then that is at least some aspect of my relation to CODESRIA, of course, because the relationship the AGI has had with the institution to this point. I teach in the Department of African Literature at WITS. It's a very special department. It is established in 1983. This is the 40th year anniversary by Eske Mpahlele, following his exile. He was banned, he was a teacher. He refused to teach Bantu education, and that's part of how I want to anchor what it means to then think about this space and its function, what it is for, because the nature of education, in fact, the expansion of education, primary education, has always supported the function of making good citizens, palatable ones who don't do insurrection, in fact. So there's a kind of tautological foolishness to almost make the claim in the very space from which we speak. He was banned as a teacher, he came back. The department is deeply located within African, not just literary and cultural studies, but intellectual traditions and histories itself. And I can say my students in gender and writing, second years, wrote their exam this afternoon. They do feminism, we don't do African feminism. It's not particular, this is our universal. And so that is the history of where I'm situated. How I end up there to find a feminist supervisor, in fact, for my PhD. I'm moving around on pages. So I'll talk a bit about time and its function and what it normalizes, and partly reflecting on what implicitly is at the structure of not only questions of how do we know what we know, but why do we know what we know. And so, for example, the family metaphor often is used to think about, say, for example, intergenerational dialogue or inheritance as it relates to, so inheritance in all the formal and informal ways it may apply, and it also is often structurally what defers to the future, the work it may do to claim the things that are claimed to be done in the name of justice, particularly within these spaces. So why do we know what we know? And the first principle is to think about the university status itself. It is a prophetic organization, to use the terms of Fred Moten and Stefano Hanni, i.e. it is by design that it will produce people who not only will leave oftentimes not remembering what they learned, but that they will function within a system that they do not question. It's based on fear. And in part, I know it from where I work, people don't even recognize it's a militarized space. Why are universities so militarized? What is so dangerous about what may happen there? And if the function of its disciplinary order is there's an implicit criminality to be in the space itself, but it becomes so neutral and it's normalized again, often through a kind of unsubstantiated deferral to familial metaphors. You come and you will replace me, and et cetera, but the obligation rather than investment. And I think I asked this question earlier to say, what does it mean to go from you are now admitted to a space to then extended, not just to the permission, but to say, is there even a position to have an intramural conversation in the first place, particularly when it's rooted in a structure of obligation rather than I invest, So the university has this function. In principle, that's what it reproduces, and it also goes to where, words come up and they become very important jargon, claims. People say, I'm decolonizing something, the structure looks nothing like it has interrogated the very foundation of what a research proposal is, because this is how it reproduces its very self. It is intentional, it is not by coincidence. Similarly, that historiographical processes often are normative. So in fact, someone will say, in this time or pre-colonial, and there's a judgment attached to it that's very present and ideological, but it becomes a particular foundation for the normative function of time itself. So the future is a deferral for better. The past was something we recuperate without much normative interrogation. And the example, Prof. Tamale has given us, the concept of gender has been disrupted substantively by African feminists, but we still have a form that says MF. And if I imply the use of pronoun or multiple relations, i.e. that our gendered selves are not biologically essential, both the science of it as well as its cultural category are still normatively assumed, and any disruption to it is perceived as new, rupture, insurrectionary, and a debate that was long established, but that the normative function is to essentialize, because the normative function of it is to maintain the substructure of power at the heart of it. So it is not by accident or coincidence, even though it is simply what we presume to be the ritual process of the university life itself. The family as a social organization, a prophetic one, in fact, support of the university system, its social division of labor, space, and power, becomes sensible as a metaphor in this precise way, despite how we can use words in very complicated terms, again, sutured to the very function of this space and its own sensibilities. And so I think also the question came up about translating from the official languages as their status is given to local languages. And part of that would be to, a consideration of actually what we mean by translation. The implicit assumption is one-to-one. There is never a one-to-one translation of any language practice. There is also no technical expertise that someone, so the idea that there's an everyday who is real and then the one who talks who is not real, that the fluency in the languages that are implied, that happen in the everyday, are constantly under invention and intervention because most people who are everyday don't speak one language fluently. They speak multiple languages. They code their ways through life. The technical fluency to read a document in a pure language is an impossibility because of how national languages come into being at a particular national moment. In particular, that has normalized, again, the family as a non-interrogated science in and of itself, despite that it invents this notion of family as the only condition for admission to the nation itself. So official languages, status quo, we have national languages which are often constructed by the very same intellectuals, political leaders, who not only essentialize past, but make language into culture and normalize territory itself. If you look at how oral formations become literacy, often through the function of translation to a Bible, the translation process and what its exegetical function does to sit language down is simultaneous to people losing their territory land. So now you must remember everything for a new place that now says it's your identity. There's complete historical erasure of that process and in particular gendered formations by which language is codified as official or singular or one. Dialect, vernacular, and other terms local often have no actual reference of meaning, even in linguistic studies, because they simply are assumed like the everyday to be value-neutral statements that can signal things like rationale or relevance. In fact, so we have even the idea to say, African woman, it's an old thesis. It's relevant, look at the suffering, look at the details. It's a method, nobody knows why. It's a consequence. There's a knownness of this person I don't have to engage, but I can refer to, because what happens then is the issue with sort of then articulating within a classroom space with intention and not a deferral, the complexity actually required, if that was the intention at all. But once again, I return to the prophetic organization of the very space itself, where in fact what fluency does look like, how it is designated, which is why a person can say things fluently in a language that means complete, it means nothing, because meaning is often about context. But it can add precisely as what we perceive as expertise, while we also rely on expertise from the everyday who is already known. So I'm trying to see about, reproductivity also, in terms of how this then governs the university's reproductivity. For example, land, which then becomes the majority of what we eat is produced by people who have no access to land, who we would call women, who do the care work of sustaining an economic structure that is unsustainable, while also being the reason why we can rationalize that work is important. Reproductivity, where things go from a monoculture, which is often the monolingualism of disciplinary processes, are all completely and intentionally suited together, along with expertise. And yet, again, the kind of linguistic essential of science and culture as normatively sort of assumed to be always already known and not to be engaged is precisely actually what sustains that economic structure itself. So I think reproductivity as a substructure of an economy that's the nation has produced precisely through the university's admission is an intention, it's prophetic. And so when we see the ritual process of the same, time is not moving, that stasis, that of course, that I'll conclude there. I'll also conclude with a portion of this poem. That stasis, if it is intentional, then makes the process of this kind of a conversation requires another substance if the intention is an intramural. That is to say, implicitly, and I opened it up and then it was deferred, so I'm opening it up again. If the intention is the intramural, then it has to be difficult. The family must not be able to hold itself. That's just how I feel. And I will close with this beautiful, it's an essay, but it's a poem. It's a collection of that same poem. It says, "Today there is no black, no dark, no light. Today there are only blues and blood, hope and heart. A half-done face in a coffin. A brewing storm of small girls is coming." Thank you.
Yes, for a very engaging presentation, starting from the challenge about knowledge production and the invitation by Sylvia Tamale for us to rethink gender, to rethink and deconstruct the way of being, to think about decolonizing and look at knowledge production, look at the knowledge that's marginalized and see how we can bring out what has been marginalized by trying to bring out what is localized, challenging the norms that we have already learned for so long. To the second panelist, studying as a Muslim woman, studying and teaching Islam in a country which is largely predominated by Muslims, and her sharing of her experience with us, which made me feel like I really, really want to sit with her over lunch and we talk some more about the parts that I missed because of translation. And all this brings in squarely the question of decolonization, how we really need to decolonize. And the last presentation, how do we know what we know? And why do we know what we know? These are critical questions that we need to ask as scholars, as academics, to find out where we are. I'm now going to open the discussion, and I request that we ask at least each panelist a question. 3 questions first, so if the first one goes to one, the next one should go to the other. I want to know who has the mic. The mic is over there. I have a question at the back, and then the second one there, and third one there. Let's start with, Professor Danson Kayana.
Thank you so much. This has been a very lovely panel. My question goes to Professor Sylvia Tamale. I would like you to reflect, to share with us your experience. Like in the last 30 years of your teaching, the stages you have gone through reaching this current thinking. Because I don't believe that you have always had this kind of thinking from the beginning. Could you share with us those moments of decolonization that you have experienced as you did your work? Thank you.
Okay, the next one is right behind Professor Danson Kayana, and then we'll come to you. Okay, the mic is already there.
Thank you very much. My name is Mildred. I'm a gender student. My question goes to Professor Sylvia Tamale. So, which philosophy are we going to deconstruct the perception of gender, and how are we going to position this philosophy so that it cannot face backlash? Thank you.
Okay. The last, and I hope it's not going to go to Professor Tamale. If it goes to her, add to another person.
Actually, the question goes to the entire house. I'm so sorry. I'm based on Mutambe Nkuruma. I'm a student of social sciences. At the same time, I'm a student leader. So for me, my question is, how can the current generation, amidst challenges, refocus and reposition ourselves to jointly achieve Pan-Africanism and gender equality, because we have a tendency of mistaking gender equality for Westernization. we are borrowing our own African cultural values and norms into westernization in the name of achieving gender equality. If we have a hen going for a cock and a cock going for a hen, but in westernization they want to tell us that the cock should go for a cock, I really don't get it. Then in conclusion, we have a challenge. There is a challenge and I'm making a report. I'm reporting to you, my fellow youth, the current generation. We have few revolutionaries, we have few activists. Actually, today I was among the mobilizers for this function, but people, before they ask you what is the function for, they are asking, is there food? Are there allowances? You get it? So I don't know how we are going to reproduce the Professor Sarasari, how are we going to reproduce the Miriam Matembes and people who are going to carry on your legacy. Because I am very sure for you, by the time you brought these ideas, you actually used to operate and mobilize people on empty stomachs. But for us, before we come here, we want to know whether there is food, whether there are allowances. We cannot build for the future, and we cannot revive and redefend the political, social, economic boundaries of this continent. Thank you. Best of time.
Thank you very much. I think we want to respond to that, and then if there are any other questions, we'll go for the second round. I can see another hand there. Do we want to add one more? Oh, there's Professor Grace Akelo over here. Take the microphone there and then bring one here. Then we'll respond to those 5 questions and comments.
So I'm standing up to respect each and everybody. It's a very simple comment and maybe take home. Ladies and gentlemen, the speakers were mentioning that how do we reroute knowledge, and then how do we cultivate? All these we are coming from the panelists. So my dear friends, one of the panelists actually came up with a nice poem. And my name's Andrew Amala from the Department of Adult Education, Mackay University. So I'd like to urge each and everybody here that Nyerere under his theory says that education should not eject you from the society. So we elites tend to be out of the society. So what I'm saying is that we should go back to societies and deal with the kids, give them poems about gender insensitivities. I think in that kind of system we can recalculate, we can regenerate knowledge. And then finally, as elite members, we should always be part of the community, and we should also use the drama and artists that have been here. They have the knowledge. They should come up with some small songs and poems that we can even have in the new curriculum so that we have the gender sensitivities eradicated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And finally?
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Lawrence, for giving me. I want to direct my question to Professor Penda. So one of the sessions today, we understood that in addition to decolonizing this concept of gender, and we're already having challenges. In Senegal, we also have the issue of Islam and how this is having an impact on this discourse. If we had moved 10 steps ahead, now we have gone back 20 steps. As a scholar of Islam and also very much immersed in the world of secularism, I am very interested in this in your point of view about this whole deconstructing gender, decolonizing gender, but also in this very special context whereby we have the impact of religion on our work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll now have the panelists respond, starting from... Okay, Professor Pendambo would like to respond. Okay, Sylvia, you can start.
Thank you very much. My experience in the last 30 years, the stages that I went through to get to where I am on decolonization. I think it, after 3 decades of very passionate activism, when you realize, you get the feeling like a hamster on a wheel or a woman on a treadmill. When you're running on a treadmill, you're not going anywhere, but you're sweating. You're sweating very hard, but you're not going anywhere. That feeling was very, very strong. We did everything that we are told will bring human rights and will bring development, and nothing was changing. In fact, things were getting worse. So that any human being with a brain will think twice and say, there is something we are doing wrong. And it became very clear to me that something that we are doing wrong actually lies in our understanding of very simple things. Our understanding of who we are as African people, as women, as, we have been, knowledge has been pushed down our throats from when we were very young, through education, through religion, alien religions, the Muzungu was, you have to give it to him or her. They were very, very successful in that project of capturing our minds, capturing our brains through structures like the law, education, the media, and so on and so forth. So even without us thinking about it, we have taken this knowledge as common sense. We celebrate February 14th as, what is it? What do you call it? Valentine's Day, without even thinking about its meaning. Black Friday, all kinds of things, Christmas, without giving it a second thought, because it has been embedded in our brains like it is the norm. We had our religions before colonialists came here. They came here and told us our religions were rubbish, and they rebaptized them as witchcraft. And like fools, we also repeat, that's witchcraft. So they were very successful. So for me, it was after that realization, it was like, my goodness, I don't have to follow what I was told. Actually, they are alternative. Humanity is so diverse that we cannot reduce it to one globalized norm, that this is the normal, this is how things must be. This is the only way we can be our being. There are so many, humanity is so diverse that we must take into account the diversity and plurality of humanity. Because when we don't, we inevitably marginalize, push some people to the margins and pretend that they don't exist. So when you sit up there and say, cocks go for cocks and hens go for hens, if I am homosexual and I'm sitting here, what are you doing to me? You're saying I don't exist. If I am transgender, what are you saying to me? I don't exist and I don't have a right to be in this world. And these are things that we have learned from religions that were introduced here not even 200 years ago, very, very recently. Africa has been here for centuries. We had our own values, we had our own norms that embraced, plurality, very accommodating a spectrum of diverse gender and sexual identities, for example, founded on ethos like Ubuntu, humaneness, solidarity, interconnectedness. All that was thrown out of the window because we are told we are uncivilized and theirs is what is civilized and that is what we must follow. And like fools, we just followed. And it is repeated over and over again through education, through laws, through media, through all these other structures that were put in place. So they don't have to be here, they did their job. So decolonization is not just about lowering the Union Jack. It is about our minds, reclaiming our minds. To learn that learning doesn't only happen in the four walls of a lecture hall. That man or woman in the village who knows which seeds to plant when and how to preserve the soil is also knowledge that is worth learning. We have been totally colonized. So what I did, because there are so many books that tell us that, although they are not as popular as the books that are donated to us on a daily, you're beginning a gender and women's studies program, here's a library of books to continue thinking and using the foundation of their ways of thinking. So there are many books, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, so many that will open our minds to the realities and stop this big lie that all of us are victims of. So we can begin by reading those books and beginning to understand and beginning to value our Africanness. Although we have been told over and over again that we are somewhere below them. We are not. Which philosophy are we going to use to deconstruct the concept of gender? Our own indigenous philosophy. And we can begin with Ubuntu. And you can read about Ubuntu and understand what it's about, the African philosophy of Ubuntu. But there are so many other African philosophies, not just Ubuntu. Our philosophies that recognize plurality, our philosophies that don't reduce everything to dualities, that you are either this or that. If you don't fit in those two neat little boxes, you are nobody. Those philosophies are they exclude human beings, they exclude people, they're terrible and very dangerous. So we have, even in the School of Philosophy, I don't know how much African philosophers are taught and how much feminist philosophy is taught in that department. But these philosophies exist, it's just that they don't make it. And again, this is all part of the colonization project which is ongoing, colonizing our minds. So it can be done. We need to decolonize, begin by understanding that in many African societies, gender was never just men and women. There was a recognition of others in between. It was a continuum. And they were never thrown over the cliff. They were recognized as, okay, they may have been, a minority, but they were not criminalized because we had our own criminal sanctions in customary laws, or what they call customary laws, which is also very problematic. So we have a long way to go, but I think that you can begin by reading, and I think what we need to do is begin by putting together a reading list of some of these very simple, accessible books that you can read about decolonizing the mind. Because our minds are so colonized, many of us take it for granted. It is common sense, and we think that anything African is uncivilized, including our own languages. We have a lot of work to do. Most of what we are learning is rubbish, actually.
Thank you very much for that response. We come to Danai. I think it was a comment. Do you want to say something?
Oh, I see, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the comment on people don't have money and so it's expensive to engage in this, but also, again, deferring even the question of sexuality to an individual or to ideological is precisely the mistake, and I think the present will show you it's not an accident that people go to university thinking they'll get a good life, which is organizing your life. Your time, in the morning you do this, you organize this, you finish this, you hope to reproduce like this. It's not an accident that most of our countries have people who finish their degree and do not have a job, or the job cannot sustain them. What I'm precisely saying is the stakes are yours. If you have no fugitive relation to what I'm saying about knowledge, that is, the stakes are that we live it out. There is no change in the future where people's employment will lead to a good life. That is the substructure. When I say reproductivity and an organizing of sexuality as a social field, from the day you are born to the day you die, its effects are that, yes, there's no money for food. Who's making food? Where does it grow? Who plants it? What does it cost? That is the field of sexuality. The stakes of it are not humorous, homophobic jokes that are then called proverb or science. The stakes of it are people's lives at heart. And it's precisely also the case that to repeat after me things I think I know when I don't know, and a lack of common sense, its consequences. AI is smarter than most people with a degree at this point. The consequences of repeat after me is more of this economic substructure, ripping apart the social fiction of a realm of consistency that you will enter it. No one is entering it. It's a fantasy. So that's what the stakes of what I'm saying is common sense will say, this is a consequence that is intentional. How you want to relate to it? And so that's for me, when I say the classroom has that potential, it's a fugitive relation to the university. It is not to reproduce it.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Penda.
To respond in English, because English speaking, c'est la dictature des English speaking, dictator of English speaking. I will try to say something about Pan-Africanism and gender equality. I think the identity of African continent is the identity of woman. If we take the history of Africa, all history of Africa is based on the woman position and the role played by women in our continent. It is women since the Neolithic who, for example, discover the grain, how to begin agriculture, what is agriculture, and it is women who push the African society to sedentarization, to settle down and to say, okay, I don't want to go to place to another place. I want to stay here with my family and with my children. And Sheikh Anta Diop, for example, give us good information on the unity of African society and African, culture. He said that woman is at the base of the African culture, and it is what is in our continent we find the role played by matriarchy and the role played by the system of inherited by woman, the matrilineal system. Since the period of Middle Ages, antiquity, perhaps women are playing the role after the role she played during the Neolithic. And I think the identity, if you go everywhere in Africa, specifically West Africa, and even in East or everywhere in Africa, the identity, for example, creating village, creating cities, women are at the beginning on different myths of creating cities and all society. I think it's not difficult to build Pan-Africanism by using the role played by women and by using, for example, the question of African culture and African unity and the role played by women. If you go for traditional, for example, culture, traditional religion, it is the priests, all of them are women. And the knowledge, the traditional knowledge, until today, is controlled by women in the continent. I think to build it is possible by using our own equality to build a new vision on feminism. The role played by all the historians is very important on that. It is, for example, by using the place of woman, it's possible for me to have enracinement, to have our identity, which is different. It is the acculturation, for example, coming from religion, monotheistic religion, and colonization will bring patriarchy in our societies. But the South African society is specifically society of women. And it is why, for me, it's important the role women can play on building the new Pan-Africanism. It's not possible. Even you have many political, like Nkrumah, Mandela, all of them making theory on Pan-Africanism. I think the role women will play on Pan-Africanism will be very important. Even on the question of climate change, I think climate change, women are the most important people who can do something on climate change. We can, for example, take Wangari Maathai as a reference, not only a reference, but a person who make a very important role before everybody about the question of climate change. I think we have something to do. And of course, I think colonization is ending today. It is my opinion. Even a country like Senegal, where France plays a very important role. For France, two countries are very important. Algeria, because it was a colony of population, people, it is something which prolonge France, and Senegal, which is the model of colonization. Senghor, for example, is the best model of assimilation, French assimilation. But the problem is now the new generation today. It is what is happening in Senegal, what is happening in Burkina Faso, Mali, everywhere. They don't know France. They didn't go to study in France. They don't have they don't speak very well French. They don't know French, and decolonization, if you want or not, is going on today in Africa. It is the end, in my opinion, of decolonization, what we call, for example, neocolonialism. It is the end. Perhaps it is evolution of society, human society, which is going in this way. And the most important thing about Islam and definition of Islam is, Islam is very diverse everywhere. Islam in Iran is different to Islam in Saudi Arabia. Islam in Saudi Arabia is different to Islam to Turkish. Islam to Turkish is a little different to Islam in Senegal. I think the role played by culture is very important. For example, why in Senegal you have development of brotherhood everywhere? It is relating, in my opinion, to our own culture. The role played by, for example, our own culture, a culture of source also, where people are not very well educated in Islam, and things are changing today. I think the position and the big problem, for example, for Islam is how to change Islam in a country like Senegal, where they don't have, they think, Orthodox Islam for them. And it is why we have our own identity. Our own identity, I give you an example. The only example I can give you is the role play on the Mouridism by the figure like Mam Diara Bousso, the mother of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. If you go outside, you can ask, who is the father of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba? People don't know necessarily, but the father of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba is Mam Moran Tassal. Everybody knows who is the mother of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. Because it is, in my opinion, a consequence of woman, the role of woman and matrilineal system play on our society. Even Mam Diara Bousso, you cannot find that in Arabic country, for example. We have a cult of Mam Diara Bousso in our society. And of course, Islam is a reality, but not Islam is not taking all the place and controlling, for example, women. I am a woman. I am teaching history of religion, specifically history of Islam. I have problems sometimes. People think that I am woman, but when I bring knowledge on the table, they respect me. And of course, between the 19 and 2000, the change of power in Senegal, the role played by women or for the renewal of democracy is very important in Senegal. Until today, I think Islam is not really now, because we make a very important work in my society. Like Fatou Sow, me, other women, we try to challenge all these things and say, okay, you are a Muslim country, but before being Muslim country, you are African country and African culture. Which is why I am totally against the veil in Senegal. I say putting the veil is not African. Putting the veil is something relating to patriarchal system, to Arabic society, from Afghanistan, and the way we wear clothes, for example, is a response relating to climate, relating to everything. But putting the veil is not our identity. It is what I say every day, every time. If you want to be, I am a Muslim, what I wear is very good, no problem. We need just to be decent. Even everywhere, even in Catholic Church, everywhere you must be decent. Why do we shift our identity? I refuse that. Perhaps it is the debate how, for example, to strengthen the African culture and to strengthen African personality. We don't want to depersonalize by everything which comes to Africa, religion, colonization, everything. We need, for example, it is why African personality is very important. We must be diverse, having different faith, having different things, but we need to be African before everything. Thank you.
Can we have a bigger clap? Because I think we couldn't have ended on a better note than on this. A call upon us to go back to the roots, to rediscover the role of women in our cultures, in our research, and reposition the conversation of decolonization so that we are rooting it on the foundations that we already had in our systems, in our cultures. I would like to thank the panel very much for a wonderful discussion this afternoon. And I would also want to thank you, the audience, for your patience. Clap for yourselves. We've had a rich discussion, and I want to bring this to a conclusion.